The moment I noticed my sister standing near the window with two men I had never seen before, I felt it settle in my chest like a held breath that refused to leave. She wasn't laughing. She wasn't smiling the way she did when cameras were pointed at her. She was whispering, precise and controlled, sliding a thin folder from her clutch and tapping it once with her finger as if underlining a conclusion. Then she looked up and met my eyes across the room. She didn't look away. That was when I knew she was ready. This wasn't a coincidence or a misunderstanding or another one of her harmless power games. She had hired private investigators to prove I was lying about my inheritance, and she had chosen tonight to let the truth come out. Not quietly, not privately, but here surrounded by family donors and people whose opinions could stain a reputation in a single evening. If she succeeded, I would lose more than money. I would lose my wedding before it even happened. I would lose my standing in the family, my credibility, and the one thing she had never been able to take from me before, the belief that I was honest. What she didn't know was that everything she had gathered to destroy me was already unraveling her own carefully protected life. I stood there with a glass of untouched wine in my hand and let her believe she was in control. The room was warm with low music and polite conversation, the kind of elegant pre-wedding gathering my parents insisted on hosting. Crystal glasses clinked softly. Someone laughed too loudly near the bar. The event had been framed as a celebration, but beneath the surface, I could feel the tension coiled and waiting. My sister moved through the crowd with practiced grace, touching arms, nodding at the right moments, making sure she was seen. She had always understood the value of visibility. I had learned a different lesson growing up. Silence, when used correctly, could be louder than any accusation. She had never forgiven me for the will. When our mother's estate was finalized months earlier, it wasn't the money that fractured us. It was the shift. For the first time in our lives, the balance of power tipped away from her. The inheritance placed something in my hands that she believed belonged to her by birthright effort and sheer force of will. I didn't celebrate it. I didn't flaunt it. I accepted it quietly, assuming that dignity would be enough. It wasn't. By the time the rumors reached me, they had already taken shape. I was careless with money. I had manipulated a vulnerable parent. I was hiding something. Each version was slightly different, but they all shared the same purpose: to make people question me before I ever opened my mouth. That was how she operated. She never attacked directly. She prepared the ground, softened it with doubt, and let others do the digging. Tonight was the culmination of that work. One of the men with her glanced toward me, then away, as if checking a detail against a memory. The other leaned closer, nodding as she spoke. I didn't need to hear them to understand the structure of the conversation. Evidence, timeline, conclusion. My sister liked things neat. She caught my eye again and smiled small and confident. I smiled back. It had taken me weeks to understand what she was really doing. At first I thought it was just another attempt to intimidate me into giving up what she wanted. Then strangers began asking careful questions. Then family members started repeating phrases I had only heard her use. Then I noticed how much effort she was putting into proving I was dishonest, instead of simply contesting the inheritance itself. That was the moment it clicked. She wasn't trying to take something from me. She was trying to discredit me before I could notice what she was hiding. I turned slightly, positioning myself near the edge of the room. From here, I could see nearly everyone. My parents sat together on the couch, their faces tight with expectation. A few relatives avoided my gaze entirely. Others watched me with curiosity, the way people look at someone they suspect will soon be exposed. My sister had always been good at creating an audience. She approached one of our aunts and spoke in a low voice. I didn't catch the words, but I recognized the tone. Concern disguised as reluctance. Responsibility wrapped in hesitation. She wanted everyone to believe she had no choice but to speak up. I wondered how long she had rehearsed this. The strange thing was how calm I felt. Not because I wasn't afraid, but because fear had already done its worst to me weeks ago alone in my kitchen when I realized how far she was willing to go. What remained now was clarity. She believed I would panic. She believed I would interrupt her, deny everything, beg someone to listen. She believed I would make it easier for her. I had no intention of doing that. Instead, I focused on details. The way the folder in her hand was thicker than it needed to be. The way the men near her kept their distance, careful not to draw attention. The way she avoided standing too close to anyone who might ask her an unscripted question. She was confident. Too confident. Someone brushed past me and murmured, "Congratulations." I thanked them and watched my sister shift positions again, guiding the room's attention without ever appearing to do so. She was building momentum. I caught a fragment of her voice as she passed behind me. "It's better if it comes out now." That was the first time my pulse spiked. Not because I didn't know what she meant, but because I knew what she didn't. For months, she had been so focused on proving I was lying that she failed to notice what her own investigation was revealing. She had trusted professionals to dig verify document. She had assumed that information once collected belonged to her alone. She was wrong. I had learned long ago that the most dangerous people are the ones who believe they are untouchable. My sister had built her life on that belief. Tonight, she was about to discover its limits. As the music softened and attention subtly shifted toward the center of the room, I felt the weight of the moment settle. This was the point of no return. Once she spoke, nothing would go back to the way it was. I straightened my shoulders and took a slow breath. I wasn't here to defend myself. I was here to let the truth choose its moment. And as I watched my sister step forward, ready to expose me in front of everyone I loved, I knew something she didn't yet understand. This was the last night she would ever feel in control. The first time everything truly shifted between my sister and me happened in a room that smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. It was the law office, where our mother's will was read, a place so neutral it felt designed to absorb emotion without reacting to it. Beige walls, a long wooden table, a clock that ticked loudly enough to make silence uncomfortable. I remember thinking as we took our seats that this would be simple, formal, sad, but contained. I had already grieved privately. I assumed my sister had too in her own way. She sat across from me, perfectly composed, her hands folded neatly on the table. She wore the same expression she always did in situations where she expected to win. Calm, patient, almost indulgent. As if the rest of us were about to catch up to something she already understood. The attorney cleared his throat and began. At first, nothing felt wrong. He spoke about practical matters, about dates and formalities, about how our mother had taken care to update everything properly. I watched my sister closely, expecting some sign of emotion. There was none. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at the documents. She watched the attorney the way a chess player watches the board, already anticipating the end. Then the distribution was read. I didn't react at first, not because I wasn't surprised, but because surprise takes a second to register when it contradicts a lifetime of assumptions. The room seemed to pause. The attorney's voice continued steady and professional, as if what he was saying didn't have the power to rearrange the family hierarchy in a single paragraph. My sister's posture changed almost imperceptibly. Her shoulders tightened, her jaw set. Still, she didn't interrupt. I felt the eyes of our parents shift toward me, then away again, as if looking too long might be impolite. The inheritance wasn't dramatic on paper, but it was decisive, clear, intentional. Our mother had left no room for interpretation. When the attorney finished, the clock was still ticking. My sister smiled. It wasn't a warm smile or a shocked one. It was the kind of smile people wear when they're doing math in their head and don't like the answer. She thanked the attorney, asked one or two clarifying questions that had nothing to do with the distribution, and gathered her things with careful efficiency. Only when we were standing in the hallway did she finally look at me. "That's unexpected," she said lightly, as if commenting on the weather. I nodded. I didn't trust my voice yet. She studied my face, searching for something. Guilt, glee, apology. When she didn't find it, her smile faded just enough to reveal irritation beneath it. "Well," she said, "I'm sure we'll talk about it." We didn't, not then. What followed wasn't an argument or a confrontation. It was something far quieter and far more damaging. It was a shift in how questions were asked, how pauses were filled, how concern began to sound like suspicion. At the next family dinner, someone asked me if managing the inheritance felt overwhelming. Another relative wondered aloud whether I'd spoken to a financial advisor. yet their tone suggesting I might not be capable of making responsible decisions. No one accused me of anything directly. They didn't have to. The implication did the work for them. My sister sat at the table, nodding sympathetically, never leading the conversation, but never stopping it either. She had always been good at letting others draw the conclusions she wanted. Growing up, she had been the obvious choice, the ambitious one, the organized one, the child teachers praised and relatives bragged about. I had been the reliable one, the helper, the one people trusted but never quite admired. Our parents didn't mean to create that imbalance. They just reinforced it year after year in small ways. Who was asked for advice? Who was given responsibility? Who was expected to handle things? And who was expected to excel? The will disrupted that pattern. I think that was what my sister couldn't forgive. Not the money itself, but the message. The implication that everything she had built didn't automatically entitle her to everything she wanted. Within days, she began asking questions that sounded reasonable on the surface. Had our mother seemed confused near the end? Was she under stress? Had I spent more time with her than the rest of the family? Each question was framed as care. Each carried a quiet accusation beneath it. When I answered calmly, she nodded. When I hesitated, she remembered. The first time someone asked me outright if I had influenced the decision, I laughed. It felt absurd. I assumed the idea would collapse under its own weight. I underestimated how powerful repetition could be when paired with doubt. My sister never challenged the will directly. She knew it would hold up legally. Instead, she questioned the circumstances around it, the story, the narrative. If she could make people uncomfortable enough with how it came to be, the inheritance would lose its legitimacy in their eyes even if it remained intact on paper. I began to notice how carefully she positioned herself. She spoke about fairness, about family harmony, about the importance of transparency. She framed herself as someone reluctantly forced to ask hard questions for the good of everyone involved. And people listened. I tried at first to address concerns as they came, to explain without sounding defensive, to trust that honesty would be enough. But every explanation seemed to create another angle for doubt, another detail to examine. That was when I realized something was wrong. She wasn't looking for answers, she was collecting impressions. The shift became unmistakable when a cousin pulled me aside after a birthday gathering and asked in a hushed voice whether everything about the inheritance was settled. I asked what they meant. They hesitated, then said they'd heard there were some irregularities. Irregularities. I knew then that a story was forming without me. My sister had always understood the difference between truth and belief. Belief only needed to sound plausible long enough to take root. Once it did, facts became optional. What hurt most wasn't the suspicion itself, but how quickly it spread among people who had known me my entire life. It made me question how well they had ever seen me at all. I confronted my sister once quietly in her kitchen. I asked her what she was doing. She looked genuinely surprised, then wounded. "I'm trying to protect the family," she said. "If there's nothing wrong, then there's nothing to worry about." That was the moment I understood that whatever this had become, it was no longer about resolving anything between us. It was about control. If I backed down, if I grew defensive or emotional, she would frame it as confirmation. If I stayed calm, she would describe it as calculated. Either way, she would keep pushing. By the time I realized she was no longer just questioning the inheritance, but questioning me as a person, it was already too late to stop the momentum. That was when I stopped explaining, not because I didn't care, but because I finally understood the shape of the trap she was building. If I kept responding, I would only help her refine it. The day I decided to say less was the day she decided to escalate. I didn't know it yet, not fully. I only sensed a tightening, a focus, a patience in her movements that hadn't been there before. She had stopped probing. She had started preparing. Looking back now, I can see how inevitable it all was. The will wasn't the beginning of the conflict, it was the permission. The moment she decided that whatever she needed to do to restore the old balance would be justified. And somewhere in that decision, long before strangers began asking questions and before my wedding became a stage, my sister chose a path that would eventually expose far more than she ever intended. I just hadn't realized yet how much she was willing to risk to prove she was right. My sister's voice on the phone that afternoon was softer than I remembered it ever being. She asked how I was sleeping. She said she'd been thinking about me. She even laughed a light, almost shy sound, as if we were sharing a private joke instead of years of distance. I hung up and stared at my phone for a long time after the call ended. The change didn't comfort me. It unsettled me. In our family, affection never appeared without a reason. It was transactional, purposeful. My sister had never been interested in my inner life unless there was something to gain from it. Growing up, she had learned to perform concern the way some people learn to perform confidence. It looked convincing from the outside, but it never quite reached her eyes. So when she began showing up unannounced a week later, carrying pastries from a bakery she knew I liked, I felt my instincts tighten rather than relax. "I was in the neighborhood," she said, stepping inside before I could answer properly. "I thought we should talk more." After everything. After everything was her favorite phrase. It suggested depth without specifying responsibility. She sat at my kitchen table and looked around as if seeing my apartment for the first time. She commented on my books, on a framed photo she'd never mentioned before, on the quiet. She asked if I felt lonely living alone now. It sounded like concern. It felt like inventory. Her questions came slowly wrapped in warmth. How were my finances feeling now that things had changed? Had I made any big decisions yet? Was I feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility of it all? Each question drifted toward the inheritance without naming it directly, like a river carving its way around a stone. I answered carefully. I kept my tone neutral. I didn't give her more than she asked for. She nodded, smiling, filing something away. At one point, she asked if I'd been feeling stressed lately. She said I looked tired. Then she paused, watching my face, and added, "Stress can make people forget details." It was subtle enough that I almost missed it. Almost. The visits continued. Sometimes she brought food. Sometimes she just brought herself. She stayed longer each time, settling into my space as if it belonged to her. She asked about my wedding plans, about vendors, about timelines. She asked how much I trusted the people around me. She never asked anything outright. She didn't need to. One afternoon, while she was flipping through a magazine on my coffee table, she casually mentioned a conversation I'd had with a cousin days earlier. She repeated a phrase I was certain I hadn't used with anyone else. I looked up. "How did you know about that?" She shrugged. "People talk." The answer was too easy. After she left, I replayed the moment again and again. It wasn't just that she knew something she shouldn't. It was how confident she was that she could admit it without consequence. That night, I realized I was no longer having conversations with my sister. I was being interviewed. She returned the following week with a different tone. Still warm, still gentle, but threaded with something sharper beneath it. She asked what I planned to do if anyone questioned the legitimacy of the inheritance. She framed it as a hypothetical, her head tilted sympathetically as if she were already preparing to defend me. "People can be unfair," she said, "especially when money is involved." I watched her hands as she spoke. They were steady, relaxed. She wasn't worried about me. She was measuring me. She asked if I had documentation organized, if I remembered specific conversations, if I could explain decisions clearly if asked. Each question tightened the sense that I was being assessed, not supported. When I deflected, she smiled and said I was always so private. That was when it dawned on me that she wasn't fishing randomly. She was testing boundaries, mapping reactions, identifying gaps. She wanted to know how I would respond under pressure, which details I hesitated over, where emotion might break through, and she was patient. One evening she mentioned my schedule, not in a vague way, but with precision. She referenced a meeting I'd attended and a time I usually left my apartment on certain days. When I asked how she knew, she waved it off. "You're predictable," she said lightly. "You always have been." The word predictable lingered after she left. I started paying attention to what she didn't ask. She never asked about how I felt about our mother's absence. She never asked whether I missed her. She never asked if the inheritance had changed my sense of loss. Emotion wasn't useful to her unless it could be leveraged. Instead, she focused on logistics, on memory, on credibility. One afternoon, she leaned back in her chair and said, if anyone ever looked into this, they'd want to see consistency. Stories falling apart under pressure make people nervous. The air shifted. I realized then that this wasn't about curiosity or reconciliation. This was preparation. She wasn't trying to reconnect. She was building a case. I didn't confront her. Confrontation would have only told her what I saw. Instead, I adjusted. I became vaguer. I shortened my answers. I responded with questions of my own, watching how she handled them. She didn't like that. When I asked her why she was suddenly so concerned with my affairs, she laughed and said she was just trying to be a good sister. The laugh came too fast, too rehearsed. The more I pulled back, the more attentive she became. She watched my expressions more closely. She mirrored my posture. She waited for slips. And then one afternoon, she let something fall. She mentioned a decision I had made weeks earlier that I had told no one in the family. Not even casually. It wasn't public. It wasn't visible. There was no reasonable way she should have known. I felt the ground shift beneath me. She caught my reaction and corrected herself immediately, blaming a misunderstanding, someone else's confusion. But it was too late. The mask had slipped just for a second. That night I lay awake, replaying every conversation we'd had since the will was read. Patterns emerged, questions repeated, information revisited from different angles. Her kindness wasn't spontaneous. It was structured. She wasn't collecting stories. She was collecting evidence. And suddenly, the quiet scrutiny from extended family made sense. The careful phrasing. The concern that sounded more like evaluation. Someone was feeding them a narrative piece by piece without ever appearing to accuse me directly. My sister wasn't working alone. I thought about the way she had asked about documentation, about consistency, about how others might perceive certain details. I thought about her confidence, her lack of urgency, her certainty that time was on her side. That was the most dangerous part. She believed I didn't see what she was doing. She believed I was still playing defense, still hoping honesty would shield me. She believed she had the advantage because she always had. She didn't realize that every question she asked was teaching me how she planned to use the answers. By the end of the month, I had stopped volunteering information entirely. I let conversations drift. I let silence stretch. I let her fill it when she couldn't stand it anymore. She mistook that for weakness. I mistook her kindness for a warning. Because once I understood that she was auditing my life not out of concern, but out of calculation, I also understood something else. Whatever she was building required more than suspicion. It required proof. Third parties. Structure. Which meant that at some point, her questions would stop coming from her. And when that happened, everything would change. The first sign that the situation had moved beyond my sister came from a man I didn't recognize standing a little too close to my mailbox. It was a Tuesday morning, ordinary enough that I almost dismissed the feeling in my gut. I was unlocking the box when he smiled politely and asked if I'd lived in the building long. His tone was casual, friendly, but the question felt practiced. When I answered, he nodded as if checking something off an invisible list. Then he asked where I worked. I told him, and he thanked me, stepping back with a courteous half-smile. I watched him walk away, unsettled by how smoothly the exchange ended. There was no follow-up, no curiosity, no attempt at conversation. Just a question, an answer, and a quiet retreat. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid, but the questions kept coming. A few days later, a woman struck up a conversation with me while I waited for coffee. She commented on the weather, then asked if I always came at the same time. When I hesitated, she laughed lightly and said she was just trying to decide whether it was worth changing her routine. Before I could respond, she asked what line of work I was in. It was the same pattern: polite, neutral, detached. By the end of the week, it happened again. A man at the gym. A question about how long I'd been a member. A question about my schedule. A question about whether I liked structure or flexibility. None of them introduced themselves properly. None of them lingered. Each encounter ended cleanly, as if the interaction itself had been the only objective. I stopped dismissing my instincts. What unsettled me most wasn't the content of the questions, but their similarity. Different faces, different settings, same rhythm, same careful neutrality, same way of steering the conversation without appearing to. I began replaying my sister's recent conversations in my head, the way she asked about documentation, about consistency, about how others might perceive certain choices. The alignment was impossible to ignore. These people weren't curious, they were collecting. The realization landed quietly but firmly. I wasn't being gossiped about anymore, I was being evaluated. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The world around me shifted, revealing patterns that had been invisible before. A car parked across the street twice in 1 week. A familiar face in the background of places I frequented, always just far enough away to be plausible coincidence. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't change my routine drastically. Panic would only feed whatever process was underway. Instead, I watched. And then came the first consequence. A colleague I'd worked with for years began treating me differently. He paused before answering questions. He asked for confirmations in writing where he never had before. During a meeting, he hesitated before handing me a document, glancing briefly at someone else as if checking for approval. Afterward, he pulled me aside. "Is everything settled?" he asked, lowering his voice. I asked him what he meant. He shrugged, uncomfortable. "I just heard there might be some complications. Nothing serious. I just thought I'd check." Check what exactly he didn't say. That was the moment it became real. The investigation into me wasn't just happening quietly. It was already shaping perceptions, already working. I drove home that night with my hands clenched tightly on the steering wheel, forcing myself to breathe steadily. Fear crept in, sharp and unwelcome. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because I understood how little wrongdoing mattered once doubt took hold. My sister had always been skilled at planting doubt. She never accused anyone outright. She framed questions as concerned speculation as caution. She let others feel clever for arriving at the conclusions she wanted, and now she had extended that skill beyond the family. I replayed one of our conversations from weeks earlier, the one where she'd mentioned how important it was for stories to stay consistent. At the time, it had felt abstract. Now it felt like a blueprint. She wasn't trying to expose me directly. She was outsourcing judgment. By letting professionals ask the questions, she created distance between herself and the process. She could claim innocence, concern, surprise. She could watch as others built a case on her behalf. That was the part that chilled me most. This wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate. The next time someone approached me with questions, I answered calmly, offering nothing beyond what was asked. I resisted the urge to over-explain, to justify, to defend. Each answer was measured factual and minimal. I could feel the shift when they didn't get what they wanted, a slight tightening around the eyes, a polite nod that ended the interaction sooner than expected. They were probing for inconsistencies. I decided to give them none. At the same time, I stopped correcting misinformation when it reached me through others. When a relative mentioned a rumor in passing, I didn't argue. I didn't deny it. I let the comment hang unanswered. Silence. I learned unsettles people far more than denial. My sister noticed. She began checking in more frequently, her messages framed as concern. She asked if everything was okay, if I felt supported, if I needed help managing the pressure. The irony was almost impressive. In one conversation, she mentioned that people had been asking her questions about me. She said it lightly as if amused. "I told them I trusted you," she said. "But you know how people are." I realized then how carefully she had positioned herself. If the investigation succeeded, she would appear vindicated. If it failed, she would appear loyal. Either way, she believed she would be untouched. I started documenting everything, not out of panic, but out of clarity. Dates, encounters, patterns. I didn't know yet what I would need, only that I would need something. What frightened me wasn't the presence of strangers in my life. It was how easily my sister had convinced herself this was justified, how comfortable she was paying to have me dissected piece by piece. This wasn't sibling rivalry. This was a calculated takedown. And still I stayed quiet. Because somewhere beneath the fear and anger, another realization was forming. Investigations, no matter how carefully conducted, leave trails. Questions asked have reasons. Documents requested point somewhere. People hired bring their own standards with them. If she was willing to spend this much effort proving I was dishonest, she had to be protecting something far more valuable than my reputation. That thought steadied me. By the end of the month, The presence of watchers had become part of my reality. I learned to live with it without acknowledging it. I stopped trying to guess who was involved and focused instead on what they were trying to build. They wanted a narrative. My sister wanted a conclusion. What she didn't seem to understand was that conclusions drawn too quickly tend to reveal the very things they're meant to hide. One evening, as I sat alone at my kitchen table, the city quiet beyond the windows, I finally admitted the truth to myself. She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. This wasn't about winning an argument or restoring balance. This was about control, image, and fear. And once someone chooses that path, they stop paying attention to the collateral damage they leave behind. I looked down at my hands steady despite everything and felt something shift inside me. If my sister believed I would panic, she was mistaken. If she believed I would beg for understanding, she was wrong. I would let the questions continue. I would let the investigation deepen. I would let her grow confident in the story she was building. Because somewhere in all that scrutiny, she was forgetting one crucial thing. The truth doesn't belong to the person who hires the most people to look for it, and sooner or later, all that looking was going to land exactly where she least expected. The first person to turn on me wasn't my sister. It was someone I had trusted without ever questioning why. We were sitting across from each other at a small cafe near my parents' house, the kind of place our family had gone to for years. The familiarity of it should have comforted me. Instead, I felt exposed, like I had walked into a room where a decision had already been made. They stirred their coffee longer than necessary before speaking. When they finally looked up, their expression wasn't angry or accusatory. It was careful, measured, as if they were choosing words that had already been rehearsed. "I just want to make sure you're okay," they said. "This has all been a lot." I nodded, waiting. They leaned in slightly. "People are starting to notice things. You know how that looks." That was the moment I understood something had shifted. This wasn't concern. This was evaluation. They spoke about the family, about how fragile things felt lately, about how important it was not to create more tension than necessary. Every sentence framed itself as neutral, responsible, reasonable. And yet beneath it all, there was an unmistakable message. I was the variable. I was the risk. When I asked what exactly people were noticing, they hesitated. Well, they said lowering their voice, there are questions about how everything happened, about timing. Timing! The word echoed in my head. They didn't accuse me of anything outright. They didn't need to. They implied that clarification might be expected of me soon, and that how I handled myself would reflect not just on me, but on the entire family. "People are watching," they added gently. I sat back and took a slow breath. It was remarkable how easily responsibility had been shifted onto my shoulders, as if the scrutiny itself was something I had invited. I asked who had raised these concerns. They smiled tightly. "You know how it is. Things come up. Conversations happen. Conversations. Always conversations. Never sources." As we parted, they squeezed my arm and told me they hoped I wouldn't take any of it personally. I watched them walk away, realizing that whatever loyalty had existed between us had quietly changed shape. That afternoon, I replayed the exchange over and over. It wasn't just what they said. It was how closely their language mirrored my sister's. The same phrases. The same careful balance between sympathy and suspicion. She hadn't just hired people to watch me. She had activated the family. At the next gathering, the shift was unmistakable. Conversations stopped when I entered a room. Invitations became vague. Plans were made without me and explained later as oversights. When I spoke, people listened politely but didn't engage. My sister, meanwhile, was everywhere. She moved through the house with calm authority, offering reassurance, smoothing tensions, presenting herself as the steady presence holding everything together. She never criticized me directly. She didn't have to. The space around me did the work for her. I watched her closely. She had learned something important about power. You didn't need to accuse someone to isolate them. You only needed to suggest that their presence complicated things. One evening, she pulled the same family member aside in plain view of everyone else. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I didn't need to. I recognized the posture, the concerned tilt of the head, the sympathetic hand on the arm, the expression that said she wished things weren't like this, but responsibility demanded action. Later, that family member approached me again. They asked whether I'd considered stepping back from certain decisions until everything settled. They suggested it might help calm things down. They spoke as if this were a favor to me. That was when the truth finally settled in. My sister had turned trust into currency. She had taken private conversations, half-formed doubts, and emotional loyalties, and converted them into leverage. She didn't need everyone to believe I was guilty. She only needed them to believe I might be, and they did. I felt the loss of safety before I felt anger. The realization that there was nowhere in my family I could go without being assessed, that every interaction carried an unspoken scorecard, that hurt more than the investigation. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to be alone in a room full of people who shared my blood. I stopped expecting anyone to defend me. Instead, I started observing who repeated my sister's language verbatim, who framed questions the same way she did, who avoided specifics while insisting on clarity. Patterns emerged quickly once I stopped hoping they wouldn't. I saw how the narrative had been constructed. My silence became secrecy. My restraint became calculation. My refusal to engage became evidence of something I was supposedly hiding. The more I stayed quiet, the more others filled in the blanks for me. My sister thrived in that environment. She grew bolder. She spoke more openly about next steps and eventual resolution. She hinted that everything would make sense soon. She had chosen her ending. What she didn't realize was that her urgency was revealing something else entirely. People who are confident in the truth don't rush. They don't need to orchestrate outcomes. They let time do the work. My sister was running out of patience. That was when I began to understand that whatever she was protecting had little to do with the inheritance itself. The money was leverage, not the prize. The real stakes were hidden somewhere beneath the surface, and the closer she came to exposure, the more aggressive she became. I stopped seeing my family's behavior as betrayal and started seeing it as data. Every comment, every warning, every concerned glance told me how far her influence reached. It showed me where she felt secure and where she didn't. The cost was high. I felt grief for relationships that might never recover. I felt anger at how easily doubt replaced trust. But beneath it all, something else took shape: clarity. I no longer needed approval from people who had already decided I was a problem to be managed. I no longer needed to explain myself to those who preferred suspicion over truth. I began preparing in ways no one noticed, quietly, methodically. My sister believed she had isolated me. In reality, she had given me space to think without interference, space to see the full structure of what she had built. One night, as I sat alone and reviewed everything I had observed, a question surfaced that changed the direction of my thoughts. Why was she so desperate to control the narrative now? The answer came slowly, then all at once. Whatever she was hiding could not survive scrutiny, and that meant the investigation into me was never the endgame. It was a shield, a way to ensure that if anything else surfaced, no one would believe the person who noticed it. I closed my notebook and leaned back, my pulse steady. The family I thought I had was gone, at least for now. In its place was something colder, more fragile, built on fear and appearances. My sister believed she was tightening her grip. What she didn't see was that the harder she pulled, the more she exposed the outline of what she was trying to protect. And for the first time since this began, I wasn't just reacting. I was ready to start looking in the direction she never thought I would. I stopped waiting for things to make sense the morning I realized my sister had never expected me to look past myself. That was the flaw in her plan. She assumed I would spend all my energy defending my name, correcting rumors, trying to prove I was worthy of what I had been given. She believed I would stay trapped inside the narrative she was building around me. Instead, I started looking outward, not at her accusations, not at the questions circling my character. I ignored those completely. I had learned by then that touching a lie only strengthens it. What interested me were systems, structures. the quiet machinery that ran beneath the family's surface and rarely attracted attention. I began with the things she believed were too dull for me to understand: paperwork, schedules, patterns of responsibility. I didn't announce what I was doing. I didn't ask permission. I simply started paying attention in ways I never had before. I reviewed records I had previously trusted without question. I compared timelines. I traced decisions backward instead of forward. At first, everything looked ordinary, boring even. That was the point. The most effective hiding places are built to look unremarkable. Then I noticed something that didn't fit. It was small. So small I almost dismissed it. A date that didn't align. A signature that appeared where it shouldn't have, an approval that bypassed a step everyone else was required to follow. Alone, it meant nothing. Together, it formed a shape I couldn't ignore. I went back and checked again, convinced I had misunderstood. I hadn't. The discrepancy repeated itself in different contexts, tied to different decisions, always involving the same narrow circle of authority. It didn't implicate my sister directly. In fact, at first glance, it didn't implicate anyone. But it suggested haste. People who take their time don't make the same mistake twice. I felt a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. This wasn't sloppiness, it was pressure. I needed confirmation, not reassurance, and I needed it quietly. So I reached out to someone outside the family, someone with expertise and no emotional investment. I didn't mention names. I didn't frame it as suspicion. I presented it as curiosity, a hypothetical scenario I wanted an opinion on. Their reaction changed almost immediately. They leaned forward, asked me to clarify one point, then another. They didn't dismiss the issue or minimize it. They grew precise. "This isn't accidental," they said finally. "This kind of inconsistency only shows up when someone is rushing or covering multiple layers at once." The words settled heavily between us. I asked what it might indicate. They paused. "It indicates that whatever this is, it started long before you noticed it. And it's designed to discourage questions." I left that meeting with my thoughts racing and my stomach tight. That was when the second realization hit me. My sister hadn't started questioning me after the will. She had started before it. Everything made sense in a way that was deeply unsettling. The early scrutiny, the way questions appeared before there was a public reason to ask them, the urgency she carried beneath her calm exterior. Discrediting me wasn't revenge, it was prevention. If I was known as unreliable, manipulative, or unstable, then anything I uncovered later could be dismissed without examination. The investigation into my life wasn't meant to end with a verdict. It was meant to poison the well. I understood then why she had chosen subtlety over confrontation, why she had invested in outsiders, why she had involved the family without ever fully revealing her hand. She was buying time. The weight of that knowledge was unlike anything I had felt before. This wasn't a family argument spiraling out of control. This was something that carried consequences beyond embarrassment or inheritance disputes. For the first time since this began, I was afraid. Not in a panicked way, but in the sober, grounding way that forces clarity. I realized that once you see something like this, you can't unsee it. And once you know you can't pretend ignorance is safety, I didn't confront her. I didn't hint at what I had found. I didn't change my behavior in ways that would draw attention. I stayed exactly where she expected me to be. Quiet, isolated, distrusted. But inside, everything shifted. I organized what I had noticed into clean, neutral documentation. I verified facts without expanding my circle. I made copies and stored them carefully. I learned the difference between suspicion and proof, and I refused to confuse the two. At the same time, the pressure on me increased. Questions came faster now, more direct, less patient. The investigation into my character intensified, as if responding to an internal deadline. My sister's tone changed when she spoke to me. She was still polite, still careful, but the ease was gone. She was watching me. I realized she sensed movement without understanding its source. That was the most dangerous moment. When someone knows something is shifting but doesn't know where to look, that's when mistakes happen. I had to be careful not to accelerate things too quickly. Exposure without context is chaos. I needed timing. I needed a setting where the truth couldn't be dismissed or buried. And slowly, inevitably, my thoughts returned to the wedding. My sister believed it was her stage, a controlled environment filled with witnesses who mattered. A moment where she could finalize the story she had been shaping for months. What she didn't understand was that it worked both ways. The more she rushed toward that moment, the more she revealed her fear. The more she involved others, the more records she generated. The more pressure she applied, the clearer the fault lines became. I began to see the shape of her vulnerability. It wasn't emotional, it wasn't moral, it was structural. She had built something complex enough to shield herself, but complexity always leaves seams, and seams always show when someone pulls too hard. I spent long evenings reviewing what I had gathered, cross-referencing details, making sure I wasn't imagining patterns that weren't there. I slept poorly but thought clearly. Every decision I made was measured against one question. What would happen if she realized I knew the answer was always the same? She would move faster. That knowledge steadied me. I stopped hoping the situation would resolve quietly. I stopped imagining conversations that might restore what we had lost. I accepted that whatever came next would be public, irreversible, and painful, but it would also be truthful. Late one night, I closed my laptop and sat in the dark, listening to the hum of the city outside. I felt the loneliness of what I was carrying, the weight of knowing something that could not yet be spoken. I also felt something else quieter, but stronger. Resolve. My sister believed she had isolated me into silence. In reality, she had given me exactly what I needed: time, space, and a clear view of the cracks forming beneath her certainty. She was running toward an ending she believed she controlled. I was waiting for the moment she would expose herself without realizing it. And I knew with a calm that surprised me that when that moment came, I would be ready. The moment I realized the wedding no longer belonged to me was the moment I stopped pretending it was just a celebration. It happened quietly, without drama. I was standing in the venue weeks before the ceremony, listening to a coordinator explain seating arrangements when I noticed my sister had already spoken to her. Not casually, thoroughly. The woman referenced decisions I hadn't finalized yet, concerns I hadn't voiced, preferences I hadn't shared. My sister smiled from across the room, calm and assured, as if she were doing me a favor. That was when it sank in. This wasn't just my wedding anymore. It was a stage she had chosen carefully, a space she believed she could control. I mourned that loss privately, not because the wedding itself mattered more than what was happening, but because it symbolized something simpler that I would never get back. The idea that joy could exist without strategy, that milestones could be shared without becoming weapons. I didn't tell anyone how deeply that realization cut. I absorbed it the same way I had absorbed everything else, quietly, completely. My sister needed this moment to be public. That much was clear. She had always been most comfortable when witnesses were present, when perception could be managed. Private accusations lacked the weight she craved. She wanted confirmation, validation, a collective nod that she was right, and she wanted it in a place where I wouldn't fight back. The wedding was perfect for that. I began to notice small disruptions almost immediately. A vendor claimed they hadn't received updated instructions. A seating chart was questioned by someone who shouldn't have had access to it. A detail I had confirmed days earlier suddenly required reconsideration. Each issue was minor on its own. Together they formed a pattern. My sister never addressed these problems directly. She positioned herself as helpful, stepping in to smooth things over, offering solutions before anyone could ask. She framed it as support, but I saw the underlying test. How much pressure could I absorb without reacting? I chose not to correct everything. Instead, I focused on reinforcing the pieces that mattered most. I limited access to certain decisions without announcing the change. I relied on neutral parties who had no loyalty to my family's internal politics. I simplified wherever possible, reducing the number of variables she could manipulate. From the outside, it looked like surrender. From the inside, it was preparation. I allowed my sister to see me tired, overwhelmed, quiet. I let rumors go unanswered. I let her believe the investigation, the whispers, the isolation were taking their toll. She responded exactly as I expected. She grew more confident. Her visits increased. Her tone sharpened beneath the surface warmth. She began making comments that assumed an outcome had already been decided. "When everything comes out," she said one afternoon, "people will understand." Understand what she never specified. She began hinting that the wedding would be a turning point, that it would bring clarity, closure, relief. She framed it as concern for me, but her eyes gave her away. There was anticipation there. Hunger. She stopped being careful. That was the most telling shift of all. People who are truly in control don't rush toward the spotlight. They let it come to them. My sister was moving toward it with increasing urgency, her patience thinning as the date approached. I noticed how often she checked her phone, how she scanned rooms, how she reacted sharply when things didn't move according to her expectations. She was counting on something happening, and time was no longer on her side. The closer we got to the wedding, the more openly she positioned herself as a moral authority. She spoke about responsibility, about family values, about transparency. She used language that sounded righteous and vague at the same time. I listened, and I waited. There were moments when I doubted myself. Late at night, alone with my thoughts, I wondered if I was miscalculating, if silence would be mistaken for weakness in ways I couldn't recover from, if allowing her this much room would cost me something I hadn't accounted for. But every time doubt crept in, I returned to what I knew. She was rushing. That meant something beneath her confidence was unstable. The wedding became a countdown in my mind. Each day marked another opportunity for her to make a mistake, another piece of pressure applied to a structure already under strain. I finalized my own readiness quietly, emotionally, strategically. I accepted that whatever happened would be witnessed by people whose opinions I couldn't control. I accepted that some relationships would fracture beyond repair. I also accepted that I could not stop her without revealing too much too soon. So I let her plan. I let her rehearse. I let her believe she was guiding me toward a moment I would regret. The night before the wedding, I sat alone in my room and looked at the dress hanging nearby. It should have filled me with excitement. Instead, it grounded me. It reminded me that this was still my life, even if others had tried to rewrite the story around it. I wasn't here to perform innocence. I wasn't here to beg for understanding. I was here to allow the truth to surface in a space where it couldn't be ignored. My sister believed she had chosen the perfect stage. What she hadn't considered was that stages amplify everything, not just the parts you intend the audience to see. As the final days slipped into place and the wedding drew close, her confidence solidified into certainty. She spoke less in questions and more in conclusions. She assumed agreement. She assumed silence meant submission. I watched her closely, noting every shift, every misstep, every sign of strain. She believed she controlled the ending. I knew better. Because control built on fear always cracks under its own weight. And the louder she prepared to speak, the clearer it became that when the moment finally arrived, she wouldn't just be exposing me. She would be exposing herself. And all I had to do was let her step forward. The detail that changed everything was so small it almost escaped me. I noticed it late one evening while reviewing notes I had already gone through dozens of times. I wasn't looking for anything new. I was simply checking consistency, making sure I hadn't missed a thread that didn't belong. That was when I saw it. A reference that didn't connect to my inheritance at all. A decision that predated the will, the engagement, even the first wave of questions about me. It sat there quietly out of place. At first I assumed it was coincidence, a clerical overlap, a harmless error, but something about it refused to settle. It pointed sideways instead of inward away from me rather than toward me. I followed it carefully, telling myself I was only confirming what I already knew. Within minutes, I understood I had been asking the wrong question from the beginning. This was never about me. The further I traced that thread, the less my name appeared. It led away from personal accounts and into shared structures, long-standing arrangements. Responsibilities that required trust and very few witnesses, the kind of systems people stopped checking once they were established. My inheritance was nowhere near the center of it. That realization made my hands go cold. I slowed down after that. I stopped thinking like someone under attack and started thinking like someone who had accidentally stepped into a room they were never meant to see. Every new piece I examined reinforced the same conclusion. The activity I was uncovering wasn't impulsive or emotional. It was methodical, repetitive, carefully insulated, and it had been happening for a long time. I finally understood why my sister had been so quick to escalate, why she had invested in discrediting me instead of challenging the will directly, why she had involved outsiders and turned family loyalty into leverage. I wasn't her enemy, I was her liability. If I remained credible, curious, and unafraid, I could notice things she needed to stay buried. The investigation into my life wasn't retaliation. It was containment, a way to ensure that if I ever spoke up, no one would listen. The weight of that realization pressed down on me in a way no accusation ever had. This wasn't a family disagreement spiraling out of control. This was damage control. I felt fear then, real and sharp. Not fear of humiliation or loss, but fear of consequences I couldn't yet see. Whatever this was, it didn't end with embarrassment. It ended with accountability, and that was exactly what she was trying to avoid. I resisted the urge to confront her immediately. Confrontation would only warn her. It would force her to move faster, to cover tracks I hadn't fully mapped yet. I needed time, and more importantly, I needed context. So I did the hardest thing. I did nothing. Outwardly, I stayed silent. I attended gatherings without engaging. I listened without responding. I let my sister's narrative continue to solidify around me. Every time someone questioned my credibility, I reminded myself that this was exactly what she needed them to believe. Inside, though, I was careful. I traced patterns across months and years. I learned which decisions required multiple approvals and which could be executed quietly. I noted who benefited and who merely facilitated. I paid attention to what was overly complex and what was deceptively simple. The more I understood, the clearer the stakes became. This wasn't something I could expose casually. Whispering it to the wrong person would destroy me before it ever touched her. The truth needed a setting where it couldn't be dismissed as bitterness or deflection. It needed witnesses who mattered and documentation that spoke for itself. That was when the wedding stopped being just a trap and became leverage. I didn't like that realization. I didn't like the idea of tying something so personal to something so dangerous. But I couldn't deny the reality. My sister had chosen the wedding because it was public, emotional, and symbolic. She believed those qualities would protect her. She hadn't considered how they might expose her instead. As the date drew closer, I sensed her impatience growing. She checked in more often. She spoke in absolutes. She referenced what would happen when everything finally came out. She was no longer testing me. She was waiting for a payoff. That urgency told me everything I needed to know. People who feel secure don't rush. They don't need to force endings. They trust that time is on their side. My sister didn't. She was running out of room. I spent nights weighing my options not just strategically but morally. There was no clean ending here. No version where everyone walked away intact. Whatever happened would change the family permanently. I accepted that. What I couldn't accept was letting the truth disappear simply because it was inconvenient. By the time I finished assembling what I needed, my fear had changed shape. It no longer paralyzed me. It sharpened my focus. I knew exactly what I was holding and why it mattered. I also knew I couldn't reveal it alone. The final decision wasn't whether to speak, but when. And that decision, I realized, was no longer entirely mine. My sister had set a clock in motion the moment she decided to humiliate me publicly. She had chosen her stage, her audience, and her timing. All I had done was notice what she hoped would stay hidden. As the wedding approached, I felt the strange calm that comes when there is nothing left to decide. The truth was there. The structure was there. The consequences were inevitable. I didn't need to accuse her. I only needed to let her finish what she had started. Because once she stepped forward to expose me, she would force the spotlight onto a system that couldn't survive it. And for the first time since this began, I wasn't afraid of what would happen next. I was afraid of what would have happened if I hadn't noticed at all. The night before the wedding, I closed my notes and turned off the light. The room fell into darkness, quiet and still. Tomorrow, my sister would finally get the public moment she had been chasing. What she didn't know was that it would not be the moment she had planned. It would be the moment everything she had tried to protect would begin to fall apart. The last time I almost defended myself, I stopped mid-sentence and felt something settle into place. It happened during a phone call with a relative who had always been careful with words. They mentioned a rumor lightly as if testing how it would land. I opened my mouth to correct it, to explain the missing context, to restore balance the way I always had. Then I closed it. The silence on the line stretched. I could almost hear them recalibrating, unsure how to proceed, without the reaction they expected. When they finally spoke again, their tone had shifted, more cautious, more alert. That was the moment I understood what defending myself had been doing all along. It wasn't clearing my name, it was feeding the story. From that day on, I stopped explaining anything. I didn't announce the change, I didn't make a statement or draw boundaries out loud. I simply withdrew my participation from the narrative my sister had built. When questions came, I answered them narrowly or not at all. When accusations floated past me, I let them drift. Silence became my answer. The effect was immediate and unsettling. People didn't know what to do with it. Some grew suspicious, interpreting my restraint as guilt. Others grew uneasy, unsure whether they were witnessing arrogance or composure. Conversations became stilted. Invitations grew more formal. Everyone seemed to be watching, waiting for me to slip. My sister, meanwhile, stepped into the space I left behind. She began speaking for me more openly. She explained my absence, my quiet, my lack of response. She framed it as stress, as overwhelm, as someone struggling to cope with responsibility. She sounded compassionate while quietly shaping conclusions. I watched her do it without interruption. There is a particular kind of cruelty in being spoken about as if you're not there, in having your story rewritten in your presence while you remain silent. It takes restraint not to react. It takes discipline not to correct the record. It also takes confidence in what's coming. As the days passed, the rumors evolved. Details sharpened. Speculation hardened into assumptions. I heard fragments through others, never directly. The story grew teeth. I let it. Privately, I was preparing in ways no one could see. I organized timelines until they were airtight. I verified sources twice, sometimes 3 times. I stripped away emotion and focused on clarity. Every piece of information had to stand on its own without my voice to support it. I learned to sit with the discomfort of being misunderstood, to endure the quiet glances, the half-finished sentences, the looks that asked questions no one wanted answered aloud. Silence isolates you. There were nights I questioned whether I had miscalculated, whether staying quiet would cost me more than speaking ever could. I wondered how many people had already made up their minds, how many would never revisit their assumptions no matter what happened next. Those doubts hurt. I let myself feel them fully. But every time I wavered, my sister reminded me why I was waiting. Her behavior changed as my silence deepened. She grew more confident, less guarded. She spoke in absolutes now, as if the outcome had already been decided. She began referencing the future in ways that assumed her version of events would be accepted without challenge. "When this is all over," she said once casually, as if we were discussing a scheduling inconvenience instead of my life. She hinted that clarity was coming, that answers would be revealed, that people would finally understand. I recognized the signs of someone rushing toward an ending they believed they controlled. She was afraid I might speak. That fear made her careless. She began over-explaining. She repeated points too often. She used phrases that echoed professional language she shouldn't have been quoting so comfortably. She assumed knowledge she hadn't earned publicly. I noted everything. At the same time, the cost of holding back increased. I felt the distance grow between me and people I had loved for decades. I felt the weight of isolation settle into my daily routines. Meals tasted flat. Sleep came in fragments. Restraint is not passive, it is work. There were moments when anger surged so strongly I had to step outside just to breathe. Moments when I wanted to shatter the quiet with a single sentence and watch the narrative collapse. I didn't. Because silence was doing something my words never could. It was drawing my sister out. Without resistance to push against, she leaned further into her role. She became more visible, more vocal, more convinced of her righteousness. She mistook the absence of opposition for surrender. She began preparing for a public reckoning. The wedding, which had once felt like a personal milestone, now loomed like a deadline. My sister's comments grew more pointed as the date approached. She checked details obsessively. She positioned herself strategically in conversations. She ensured the right people would be present. She was no longer testing reactions. She was rehearsing. I could feel the pressure building not just in her, but in the space around us. Others sensed something coming. Whispers carried a different tone, now sharpened by anticipation. They were waiting for a scene. I gave them none. Instead, I focused inward. I reminded myself why I had chosen this path, why timing mattered, why truth revealed at the wrong moment could be dismissed as deflection. I accepted that some damage was unavoidable, that not everyone would believe me even when the facts were clear. That dignity doesn't guarantee vindication. What it does guarantee is that when the moment arrives, you're standing on solid ground. The night before the wedding, I sat alone and reviewed everything one last time. Not the accusations, not the rumors, the facts, the structure, the connections that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with what my sister was hiding. I felt calm, not the absence of fear, but the presence of resolve. I knew my silence had been misinterpreted by many. I knew my sister believed she had won. I knew the room would not be on my side when she finally spoke. That was exactly why it would work. The next day she would step forward expecting collapse, expecting denial, expecting emotion she could dismantle. Instead, she would find nothing to push against, and in that vacuum the truth would have room to breathe. As I turned off the light and lay down, I acknowledged the cost of what I had done. The relationship strained, the trust broken, the loneliness earned through restraint. I accepted all of it. Because sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal is not to shout or defend or explain, it's to wait and let the person who believes they control the story tell it all the way to the end. The day arrived wrapped in soft light and forced smiles, the kind of beauty that feels fragile the moment you touch it. From the outside, everything looked perfect. The venue glowed with careful elegance. Flowers lined the entrance. Music drifted through the air light and celebratory. Guests moved easily between conversations dressed in colors chosen for photographs and memory. Inside me, nothing felt celebratory. I walked in knowing this was not just my wedding day. It was the day my sister had chosen to finish what she started. She was already there, of course, positioned exactly where she needed to be, surrounded by the right people. Family elders, longtime friends. A few faces I recognized from earlier gatherings, the ones who liked to be informed before they liked to be kind. She greeted everyone warmly, her smile steady, her posture relaxed as if she had nothing to hide. She looked like someone who had rehearsed this moment. I felt eyes on me as I entered, not hostile, curious, expectant. People smiled and offered congratulations, but their gaze lingered a second too long, searching my face for something they hadn't decided whether to believe yet. I returned their smiles and moved forward. My sister watched me from across the room. When our eyes met, she gave me a small nod, not a greeting, a signal. She was ready. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. I stood, I spoke, I smiled when expected to smile. Applause came and went. From the outside, I imagine I looked calm, composed exactly as someone should on a day like this. Inside, I was listening for the shift. It came during the reception, once everyone was settled, once the room had softened with food and wine and shared history. My sister moved toward the center of the space, drawing attention without ever raising her voice. She didn't ask for silence. She didn't need to. People noticed when she stood. She began the way she always did, with gratitude, thanking everyone for being there, speaking about family, about love, about how important honesty was in moments like these. Her words were warm, measured, almost tender. I felt the room lean in. Then she paused just long enough to signal that something serious was coming. "There's something I need to address," she said gently. "Something I've struggled with for months." I didn't move. She spoke about responsibility, about protecting what mattered, about how difficult it was to speak up when doing so might hurt someone you cared about. Her voice caught in all the right places. She looked down briefly, then back up as if steadying herself. She never said my name at first. Instead, she spoke in questions. What happens when things don't add up? When stories change? When important decisions are made behind closed doors? She framed it as concern, not accusation, allowing the audience to connect the dots themselves. I felt the weight of their attention settle fully on me. My sister continued explaining that she had felt compelled to seek clarity, that she had involved independent professionals to ensure everything was fair, transparent, and above board. She emphasized the word independent, letting it hang. Then she gestured subtly, and one of the men I had seen before stepped forward. The shift in the room was immediate. She introduced him as someone who had helped her understand certain inconsistencies, someone who had verified timelines and documentation. She spoke as if this were an act of courage, not calculation. The man said very little. He didn't need to. His presence alone lent authority to her words. My sister finally said my name, not sharply, not cruelly. She said it with regret. She suggested that I had been overwhelmed by the inheritance, that stress might have affected my recollection, that certain details I had shared with others didn't align as neatly as they should. She didn't accuse me of lying. She let implication do the work. People shifted in their seats. I noticed who avoided my eyes. I noticed who watched me closely waiting. I remained still. She presented documents next, not all at once, just enough to sound convincing. Dates, statements, professional language stripped of context. She framed them as evidence of concern, not guilt. The confidence in her voice was unmistakable. This was the moment she had been building toward. She spoke about how painful it was to do this publicly, how she wished it could have been resolved privately, how she felt she owed it to the family to speak up before things went any further. She looked at me, then her expression a careful blend of sadness and resolve. If there's an explanation, she said softly, now would be the time. The room held its breath. Every instinct in my body screamed to respond, to deny, to clarify, to reclaim my story before it slipped fully out of reach. I could feel the familiar urge to defend myself rise sharp and insistent. I let it pass. I said nothing. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected. I could sense discomfort spreading, people shifting, whispering behind hands. My sister's expression flickered just for a second. She hadn't planned for this part. She filled the space quickly, adding more context, more explanation, more detail than necessary. She referenced conversations she shouldn't have been privy to. She made assumptions about intent. She drew connections that didn't quite align. She was rushing. And then she went too far. She mentioned a specific procedural detail, something she framed as proof of my manipulation. It was technical, obscure, the kind of thing most people wouldn't catch. I did. So did one other person. I saw it in their face, the slight narrowing of eyes, the pause before a reaction, a question forming. My sister didn't notice. She was too focused on maintaining control. She concluded by saying she hoped this would be the beginning of healing. That transparency, however painful, was necessary for the family to move forward. She waited, clearly expecting a reaction from me. I stood slowly. The movement alone changed the energy in the room. I didn't look at her right away. I looked at the people gathered there, at the faces shaped by years of shared history, at the uncertainty, the discomfort, the anticipation. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady. I appreciate how much effort you've put into this, I said. A ripple moved through the room. My sister's confidence wavered. She hadn't expected gratitude. I turned to the man she had introduced and nodded politely. Your work has been thorough, I said. More thorough than you were hired to be. The room shifted again. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply stated one fact, then another. I pointed to a single inconsistency in the material she had presented. Just one. Enough to make people listen. I asked a question, not an emotional one, a procedural one. It was a question my sister couldn't answer without revealing something she hadn't intended to reveal. She hesitated. That hesitation was louder than any denial I could have offered. I stopped there. I didn't press. I didn't explain further. I let the room sit with the question she couldn't resolve. For the first time that day, the attention shifted away from me. I could feel it happen. My sister opened her mouth to recover, to redirect, to smooth over the moment. She didn't get the chance. Someone else spoke first, and in that instant I knew the story had changed. The humiliation she had planned for me had reached its limit. What came next would not be hers to control. Not anymore. The room didn't erupt the way my sister expected it to. There was no shouting, no immediate chaos, no dramatic gasp from the crowd. Instead, a strange stillness settled in the kind that comes when people realize something important has just shifted but haven't yet decided how to react. The question I had asked hung in the air, unanswered. My sister smiled too quickly. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said, her voice tight around the edges. "What I meant was—" She stopped, because the man she had introduced earlier, the one meant to lend her authority, didn't move to support her. He glanced down at the documents in his hands, then at the person who had spoken up from the other side of the room. I hadn't even turned yet, but I knew who it was. It was someone neutral, someone whose presence mattered. They asked my sister to repeat the details she had just mentioned, calmly, professionally, as if this were a clarification, not a challenge. My sister tried. She stumbled over the phrasing, corrected herself, then tried again. Each attempt only deepened the silence around her. The confidence that had carried her through the earlier part of the evening began to drain from her posture. I watched her closely, not with anger, but with clarity. This was the moment she realized she had overplayed her hand. I finally turned to face her. Not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge her presence. "You weren't supposed to know that," I said quietly. I didn't accuse her. I didn't raise my voice. I stated it the way one states an obvious truth. Her eyes flicked toward me, then away. I addressed the room instead. "I didn't come here planning to speak," I said. "I didn't intend to defend myself tonight. But something important was just revealed, and it isn't about me." A murmur moved through the crowd. I explained carefully how the details she had mentioned didn't align with the role she claimed to have played, how it indicated access she shouldn't have had, how it pointed to involvement beyond concern or oversight. I didn't explain everything. I didn't need to. I asked another question. This one wasn't directed at my sister, but at the man beside her. "Was that part of what you were hired to look into?" I asked, "or was it something you noticed along the way?" The room seemed to lean forward. The man hesitated, then answered honestly. He said it wasn't part of the original scope. He said it had come up during routine verification. He said he had flagged it because it didn't fit. My sister's face drained of color. I hadn't planned that. I hadn't known exactly how he would respond, but I had trusted the one thing my sister never had: professional integrity. I felt something loosen in my chest as the focus shifted. People began asking questions, but not of me, of her, of the process, of the assumptions that had led to this moment. She tried to regain control, speaking faster now, her tone sharper. She reframed, minimized, insisted that she had only been trying to protect the family. She appealed to emotion when precision failed her. It didn't work. Once the spell broke, it broke completely. Someone pointed out another inconsistency, another connection that didn't make sense, a timeline that raised more questions than answers. The structure she had relied on to shield herself began to fracture under scrutiny. I stepped back. I didn't need to lead the conversation anymore. That was the most satisfying part. For months, I had been the one under examination. Every word I spoke had been weighed, interpreted, reshaped. Now the attention had shifted, and I could see how uncomfortable she was under it. She wasn't prepared to be questioned. She tried to turn toward me again, as if pulling me back into the center would restore balance. "This isn't the place for this," she said. "We can talk privately." I shook my head once. "This is the place you chose," I replied. "I'm just responding to what you brought here." That was when the room truly turned. Not loudly, not dramatically, just decisively. People stopped looking at me, their bodies angled away from me and toward her. Conversations broke out in low voices. Someone stepped in to suggest a pause, then another to suggest continuing the discussion elsewhere. Authority shifted without announcement. I watched my sister realize piece by piece that the event was no longer hers to manage. The audience she had gathered to witness my humiliation was now witnessing something else entirely. Her voice grew strained, her arguments circular. She repeated herself as if volume or persistence might restore what she'd lost. It didn't. I felt no urge to press further, no need to pile on. Everything that needed to be exposed had already surfaced. The rest would unfold without me. That was when I understood the true power of what had happened. I hadn't defeated her. I had stepped out of her way. The consequences were no longer mine to deliver. As discussions broke off and people began moving toward quieter corners of the venue, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not triumph, not relief. Something steadier. Completion. I turned away from the center of the room and walked toward the edge where the noise softened. No one stopped me. No one questioned my departure. For the first time in months, my presence wasn't being managed. Behind me, my sister was still speaking, still trying to regain footing in a space that no longer responded to her. I didn't look back. I stepped outside into the evening air, the sounds of the reception muffled behind the doors. The night was cool and still indifferent to everything that had just happened. I stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, feeling the weight I had carried for so long finally lift. The story she had built around me was gone. In its place was something she had never prepared for. The truth examined by people who had no interest in protecting her from it. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't need to. Whatever consequences awaited her would unfold without my involvement. And that, more than any confrontation or accusation, felt like justice. I walked back inside when I was ready not to engage, but to reclaim the rest of the night on my own terms. The tables had turned, and for the first time since this began, I wasn't standing in anyone's shadow. I was simply standing. The quiet after everything ended was softer than I expected. Not empty, not cold, just quiet in a way that felt earned. The room was still full when I returned, but the energy had changed. Conversations had broken into smaller, careful clusters. People spoke in low voices, choosing words the way they should have chosen them from the beginning. No one approached me with questions. No one asked for explanations. A few met my eyes and nodded not an apology, but an acknowledgement. That was enough. I didn't stay near the center. I didn't need to. For months, attention had been something pressed against me, heavy and unwanted. Now it had loosened its grip. I moved through the space slowly, greeting the people who mattered, avoiding the ones who didn't. I didn't look for my sister. I didn't need to. Whatever was unfolding around her was no longer mine to manage. That realization settled into me gently like a long exhale after holding my breath for too long. Outside, the evening had cooled. The sky was darker now, the kind of deep blue that makes everything feel steadier. I stepped onto the terrace and let the air fill my lungs, grounding myself in the moment. Somewhere behind me, music resumed. Laughter followed, tentative at first, then easier. Life, it seemed, was moving forward. That surprised me more than anything else. I had expected vindication to feel louder, more dramatic. I had imagined relief would arrive in waves, overwhelming and immediate. Instead, it came quietly, like something that had always been waiting for me to notice it. I realized then that winning had never been the point. Surviving with my dignity intact was. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces over the days that followed. Conversations that happened without me. Decisions deferred to others. Names no longer spoken with the same confidence. I heard about it indirectly through fragments and careful phrasing. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. What mattered was what didn't happen. No one questioned my integrity anymore. No one suggested explanations or corrections. The story that had been built around me simply dissolved, unable to withstand the light it had been dragged into. My sister and I did not reconcile. I want to be honest about that. There was no dramatic apology, no tearful confession, no moment where everything was said and resolved. Some distances once created remain, and that's not a failure, it's a reality. I grieved that loss in my own time. What I gained, however, was something I hadn't realized I was missing. Peace. Not the kind that comes from being proven right, but the kind that comes from no longer needing to prove anything at all. I stopped replaying conversations in my head. I stopped anticipating accusations that never came. I stopped wondering how to be perceived. I reclaimed my voice by choosing when to use it. The wedding itself continued, not as the spectacle it had almost become, but as something quieter and more meaningful. I focused on the people who stayed present, the ones who hadn't needed convincing, the ones who had waited instead of judged. That became the memory I kept, not the confrontation, not the exposure, the stillness afterward. In the weeks that followed, I thought often about how close I had come to losing myself to the need to be understood. How easy it would have been to fight louder, explain harder, defend longer. How tempting it is when betrayed to respond in kind. What I learned instead was this: silence is not weakness when it's chosen. Waiting is not surrender when it's intentional. And dignity once reclaimed doesn't need to be announced. I didn't walk away with everything I started with. Some relationships changed permanently. Some trust didn't return. But I walked away with something more important. I walked away whole. If you're listening to this and you've ever been doubted by the people who should have known you best, I want you to know something. You don't owe everyone your story. You don't have to perform your innocence. You don't have to chase understanding from people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is step back and let the truth stand on its own. And if you've lived through something like this, if you've been underestimated, silenced, or quietly pushed into a corner by someone who thought they could control the narrative, I'd love to hear your story. Share it in the comments, not for validation, but because telling it on your own terms matters. If you found something in this story that stayed with you, consider staying with this channel. These are the kinds of stories we tell here. Stories about quiet strength, about family drama that doesn't end the way people expect, about moments when the tables turn without shouting. And if you want to be here for the next one, make sure you subscribe, not because it helps me, but because it keeps these stories alive for the people who need them. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. Some endings aren't loud, they're honest, and sometimes that's the most powerful ending of all.